Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Karl Marx's Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 17, Changes of Magnitude in the Price of Labor Power, and in Surplus Value from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 17 is the second of 3 chapters in Part 5 of 8 of Kapital, Production of Absolute and Relative Surplus Value. 17 is not a particularly long chapter, and then the next chapter, 18, is actually really on the short side, so we're almost done with Part 5. As the name of this chapter implies, we're going to be looking at changes of magnitude in the price of labor power. What is the price of labor power? Well, assuming that commodities, including labor power, are sold at the cost of production, it's the cost of producing labor power, or in other words, of maintaining a worker's life and their ability to perform labor. And of course, that part of the working day, which is responsible for generating the value to cover the wages, is the necessary labor time portion of the working day. And then, of course, the remainder is surplus, resulting in the production of surplus value. So basically in this chapter, Marx is going to look at the interplay between 3 variables: the length of the working day, the intensity of labor, and the productiveness of labor, and then looking at the interplay between these 3 as they change as regards changes of magnitude in the price of labor power and surplus value. So let's begin. The value of labor power is determined by the value of the necessaries of life habitually required by the average laborer. The quantity of these necessaries is known at any given epoch of a given society, and can therefore be treated as a constant magnitude. What changes is the value of this quantity. There are, besides, 2 other factors that enter into the determination of the value of labor power. 1, the expenses of developing that power, which expenses vary with the mode of production. The other, its natural diversity, the difference between the labor power of men and women, of children and adults. The employment of these different sorts of labor power, an employment which is, in its turn, made necessary by the mode of production, makes a great difference in the cost of maintaining the family of the laborer, and in the value of the labor power of the adult male. Both these factors, however, are excluded in the following investigation. I assume 1, that commodities are sold at their value, and 2, that the price of labor power rises occasionally above its value, but never sinks below it. On this assumption, we have seen that the relative magnitudes of surplus value and of price of labor power are determined by 3 circumstances. 1, the length of the working day, or the extensive magnitude of labor. 2, the normal intensity of labor, its intensive magnitude, whereby a given quantity of labor is expended in a given time, and 3, the productiveness of labor, whereby the same quantum or amount of labor yields, in a given time, a greater or less quantum of product, dependent on the degree of development in the conditions of production. Very different combinations are clearly possible, according as one of the 3 factors is constant and 2 variable, or 2 constant and 1 variable, or lastly, all 3 simultaneously variable. And the number of these combinations is augmented or raised by the fact that when these factors simultaneously vary, the amount and direction of their respective variations may differ. In what follows, the chief combinations alone are considered. Section 1. Length of the working day and intensity of labor constant, productiveness of labor variable. On these assumptions, the value of labor power and the magnitude of surplus value are determined by 3 laws. 1. A working day of given length always creates the same amount of value, no matter how the productiveness of labor, and with it the mass of the product, and the price of each single commodity produced may vary. If the value created by a working day of 12 hours be, say, 6 shillings, then although the mass of the articles produced varies with the productiveness of labor, the only result is that the value represented by 6 shillings is spread over a greater or less number of articles. 2. Surplus value and the value of labor power vary in opposite directions. A variation in the productiveness of labor, its increase or diminution, causes a variation in the opposite direction in the value of labor power, and in the same direction in surplus value. The value created by a working day of 12 hours is a constant quantity, say 6 shillings. This constant quantity is the sum of the surplus value plus the value of the labor power, which latter value the laborer replaces by an equivalent. It is self-evident that if a constant quantity consists of 2 parts, neither of them can increase without the other diminishing. let the two parts at starting be equal, 3 shillings value of labor power, 3 shillings surplus value. Then the value of the labor power cannot rise from 3 shillings to 4 without the surplus value falling from 3 shillings to 2, and the surplus value cannot rise from 3 shillings to 4 without the value of labor power falling from 3 shillings to 2. Under these circumstances, therefore, no change can take place in the absolute magnitude, either of the surplus value or of the value of labor power, without a simultaneous change in their relative magnitudes, i.e. relatively to each other. It is impossible for them to rise or fall simultaneously. Further, the value of labor power cannot fall, and consequently surplus value cannot rise, without a rise in the productiveness of labor. For instance, in the above case, the value of the labor power cannot sink from 3 shillings to 2 unless an increase in the productiveness of labor makes it possible to produce in 4 hours the same quantity of necessaries as previously required 6 hours to produce. On the other hand, the value of the labor power cannot rise from 3 shillings to 4 without a decrease in the productiveness of labor, whereby 8 hours becomes requisite to produce the same quantity of necessaries, for the production of which 6 hours previously sufficed. It follows from this that an increase in the productiveness of labor causes a fall in the value of labor power, and a consequent rise in surplus value, while on the other hand, a decrease in such productiveness causes a rise in the value of labor power and a fall in surplus value. In formulating this law, Ricardo overlooked one circumstance. Although a change in the magnitude of the surplus value or surplus labor causes a change in the opposite direction in the magnitude of the value of labor power, or in the quantity of necessary labor, it by no means follows that they vary in the same proportion. They do increase or diminish by the same quantity, but their proportional increase or diminution depends on their original magnitudes before the change in the productiveness of labor took place. If the value of the labor power be 4 shillings, or the necessary labor time 8 hours, and the surplus value be 2 shillings, or the surplus labor 4 hours, and if, in consequence of an increase in the productiveness of labor, the value of the labor power falls to 3 shillings, or the necessary labor to 6 hours, the surplus value will rise to 3 shillings, or the surplus labor to 6 hours. The same quantity, 1 shilling or 2 hours, is added in one case and subtracted in the other. But the proportional change of magnitude is different in each case. While the value of the labor power falls from 4 shillings to 3, i.e. by 1/4 or 25%, the surplus value rises from 2 shillings to 3, i.e. by 1/2 or 50%. It therefore follows that the proportional increase or diminution in surplus value, consequent on a given change in the productiveness of labor, depends on the original magnitude of that portion of the working day which embodies itself in surplus value. The smaller that portion, the greater is the proportional change. The greater that portion, the less is the proportional change. 3. Increase or diminution in surplus value is always consequent on, and never the cause of, the corresponding diminution or increase in the value of labor power. Footnote there, to this third law, McCulloch has made, amongst others, this absurd addition that a rise in surplus value, unaccompanied by a fall in the value of labor power, can occur through the abolition of taxes payable by the capitalist. The abolition of such taxes makes no change whatever in the quantity of surplus value that the capitalist extorts at first hand from the laborer. It alters only the proportion in which that surplus value is divided between himself and third persons. It consequently makes no alteration whatever in the relation between surplus value and the value of labor power. McCulloch's exception therefore proves only his misapprehension of the rule, a misfortune that as often happens to him in the vulgarization of Ricardo as it does to J.B. Say in the vulgarization of Adam Smith. Back to the main text. Since the working day is constant in magnitude and is represented by a value of constant magnitude, since to every variation in the magnitude of surplus value there corresponds an inverse variation in the value of labor power, and since the value of labor power cannot change except in consequence of a change in the productiveness of labor, it clearly follows under these conditions that every change of magnitude in surplus value arises from an inverse change of magnitude in the value of labor power. If then, as we have already seen, there can be no change of absolute magnitude in the value of labor power and in surplus value, unaccompanied by a change in their relative magnitudes, so now it follows that no change in their relative magnitudes is possible, without a previous change, in the absolute magnitude of the value of labor power. According to the third law, a change in the magnitude of surplus value presupposes a movement in the value of labor power, which movement is brought about by a variation in the productiveness of labor. The limit of this change is given by the altered value of labor power. Nevertheless, even when circumstances allow the law to operate, subsidiary movements may occur. For example, if in consequence of the increased productiveness of labor, the value of labor power falls from 4 shillings to 3, or the necessary labor time from 8 hours to 6, the price of labor power may possibly not fall below 3 shillings 8 pence, 3 shillings 6 pence, or 3 shillings 2 pence, and the surplus value consequently not rise above 3 shillings 4 pence, 3 shillings 6 pence, or 3 shillings 10 pence. The amount of this fall, the lowest limit of which is 3 shillings, the new value of labor power, depends on the relative weight which the pressure of capital on the one side and the resistance of the laborer on the other throws into the scale. The value of labor power is determined by the value of a given quantity of necessaries. It is the value and not the mass of these necessaries that varies with the productiveness of labor. It is, however, possible that owing to an increase of productiveness, both the laborer and the capitalist may simultaneously be able to appropriate a greater quantity of these necessaries without any change in the price of labor power or in surplus value. If the value of labor power be 3 shillings, and the necessary labor time amount to 6 hours, if the surplus value likewise be 3 shillings, and the surplus labor 6 hours, if the surplus value likewise be 3 shillings, and the surplus labor 6 hours, then if the productiveness of labor were doubled, without altering the ratio of necessary labor to surplus labor, there would be no change of magnitude in surplus value and price of labor power. The only result would be that each of them would represent twice as many use values as before, these use values being twice as cheap as before. Although labor power would be unchanged in price, it would be above its value. If, however, the price of labor power had fallen, not to 1 shilling 6 pence, the lowest possible point consistent with its new value, but to 2 shillings 10 pence or 2 shillings 6 pence, still this lower price would represent an increased mass of necessaries. In this way, it is possible with an increasing productiveness of labor for the price of labor power to keep on falling, and yet this fall to be accompanied by a constant growth in the mass of the laborer's means of subsistence. But even in such case, the fall in the value of labor power would cause a corresponding rise of surplus value, and thus the abyss between the laborer's position and that of the capitalist would keep widening. Footnote here, quoting from Outlines of Political Economy, etc. When an alteration takes place in the productiveness of industry, and that either more or less is produced by a given quantity of labor and capital, the proportion of wages may obviously vary, whilst the quantity, which that proportion represents, remains the same, or the quantity may vary whilst the proportion remains the same. Unquote, back to the main text. Ricardo was the first who accurately formulated the 3 laws we have above stated, but he falls into the following errors. 1. He looks upon the special conditions under which these laws hold good as the general and sole conditions of capitalist production. He knows no change, either in the length of the working day or in the intensity of labor. Consequently, with him there can be only one variable factor, viz. The productiveness of labor. 2. And this error vitiates his analysis much more than 1. He has not, any more than have the other economists, investigated surplus value as such, i.e., independently of its particular forms such as profit, rent, etc. He therefore confounds together the laws of the rate of surplus value and the laws of the rate of profit. The rate of profit is, as we've already said, the ratio of the surplus value to the total capital advanced. The rate of surplus value is the ratio of the surplus value to the variable part of that capital. Assume that a capital C of £500 is made up of raw material, instruments of labor, etc. This is the constant portion to the amount of £400, and of wages, the variable portion, to the amount of £100. And further, that the surplus value equals £100. Then we have the rate of surplus value, S over V, equals £100 over £100, or 100%. But the rate of profit, S over C, £100 over £500, equals 20%. And just commenting, I think that the Marxists.org rendition of this text has a typo here. The rate of profit is given as S over small c, although small c was being used for the constant capital, and capital C was given for the total capital, both constant and variable. So I think that that C should be capitalized there in the sentence, but the rate of profit, S over C. Anyway, continuing, it is besides obvious that the rate of profit may depend on circumstances that in no way affect the rate of surplus value. I shall show in Book 3 that with a given rate of surplus value we may have any number of rates of profit, and that various rates of surplus value may, under given conditions, express themselves in a single rate of profit. Section 2. Working day constant, productiveness of labor constant, intensity of labor variable. Increased intensity of labor means increased expenditure of labor in a given time. Hence, a working day of more intense labor is embodied in more products than is one of less intense labor, the length of each day being the same. Increased productiveness of labor also, it's true, will supply more products in a given working day. But in this latter case, the value of each single product falls, for it costs less labor than before. In the former case, that value remains unchanged, for each article costs the same labor as before. Here we have an increase in the number of products, unaccompanied by a fall in their individual prices. As their number increases, so does the sum of their prices. But in the case of increased productiveness, a given value is spread over a greater mass of products. Hence, the length of the working day being constant, a day's labor of increased intensity will be incorporated in an increased value, and the value of money remaining unchanged in more money. The value created varies with the extent to which the intensity of labor deviates from its normal intensity in the society. A given working day, therefore, no longer creates a constant but a variable value. In a day of 12 hours of ordinary intensity, the value created is, say, 6 shillings, but with increased intensity, the value created may be 7, 8, or more shillings. It is clear that if the value created by a day's labor increases from, say, 6 to 8 shillings, then the two parts into which this value is divided, viz., price of labor power and surplus value, may both of them increase simultaneously and either equally or unequally. They may both simultaneously increase from 3 shillings to 4. Here, the rise in the price of labor power does not necessarily imply that the price has risen above the value of labor power. On the contrary, the rise in price may be accompanied by a fall in value. This occurs whenever the rise in the price of labor power does not compensate for its increased wear and tear. We know that with transitory exceptions, a change in the productiveness of labor does not cause any change in the value of labor power, nor consequently in the magnitude of surplus value, unless the products of the industries affected are articles habitually consumed by the laborers. In the present case, this condition no longer applies. For when the variation is either in the duration or in the intensity of labor, there is always a corresponding change in the magnitude of the value created, independently of the nature of the article in which that value is embodied. If the intensity of labor were to increase simultaneously and equally in every branch of industry, then the new and higher degree of intensity would become the normal degree for the society, and would therefore cease to be taken account of. But still, even then, the intensity of labor would be different in different countries and would modify the international application of the law of value. The more intense working day of one nation would be represented by a greater sum of money than would the less intense day of another nation. Footnote here, quoting the report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1855, all things being equal, the English manufacturer can turn out a considerably larger amount of work in a given time than a foreign manufacturer, so much as to counterbalance the difference of the working days between 60 hours a week here and 72 or 80 elsewhere, unquote. The most infallible means for reducing this qualitative difference between the English and continental working hour would be a law shortening quantitatively the length of the working day in continental factories. Back to the main text. Section 3. Productiveness and intensity of labor constant, length of the working day variable. The working day may vary in two ways. It may either be made longer or shorter. From our present data, and within the limits of the assumptions made in the introduction to this chapter, we obtain the following laws. 1. The working day creates a greater or less amount of value in proportion to its length, thus a variable and not a constant quantity of value. 2. Every change in the relation between the magnitudes of surplus value and of the value of labor power arises from a change in the absolute magnitude of the surplus labor and consequently of the surplus value. 3. The absolute value of labor power can change only in consequence of the reaction exercised by the prolongation of surplus labor upon the wear and tear of labor power. Every change in this absolute value is therefore the effect, but never the cause, of a change in the magnitude of surplus value. We begin with the case in which the working day is shortened. 1. A shortening of the working day under the conditions given above leaves the value of labor power, and with it the necessary labor time, unaltered. It reduces the surplus labor and surplus value. Along with the absolute magnitude of the latter, its relative magnitude also falls, i.e., its magnitude relatively to the value of labor power, whose magnitude remains unaltered. Only by lowering the price of labor power below its value could the capitalists save themselves harmless. All the usual arguments against the shortening of the working day assume that it takes place under the conditions we have here supposed to exist. But in reality, the very contrary is the case. A change in the productiveness and intensity of labor either precedes or immediately follows a shortening of the working day. Footnote. Quoting the report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1848, there are compensating circumstances which the working of the 10 Hours Act has brought to light. Unquote. Back to the main text. 2. Lengthening of the working day. Let the necessary labor time be 6 hours, or the value of labor power 3 shillings. Also let the surplus labor be 6 hours, or the surplus value 3 shillings. The whole working day then amounts to 12 hours and is embodied in a value of 6 shillings. If now the working day be lengthened by 2 hours and the price of labor power remain unaltered, the surplus value increases both absolutely and relatively. Although there is no absolute change in the value of labor power, it suffers a relative fall. Under the conditions assumed in 1, there could not be a change of relative magnitude in the value of labor power without a change in its absolute magnitude. Here, on the contrary, the change of relative magnitude in the value of labor power is the result of the change of absolute magnitude in surplus value. Since the value in which a day's labor is embodied increases with the length of that day, it is evident that the surplus value and the price of labor power may simultaneously increase either by equal or unequal quantities. This simultaneous increase is therefore possible in 2 cases. 1, the actual lengthening of the working day, the other, an increase in the intensity of labor unaccompanied by such lengthening. When the working day is prolonged, the price of labor power may fall below its value, although that price be nominally unchanged or even rise. The value of a day's labor power is, as will be remembered, estimated from its normal average duration, or from the normal duration of life among the laborers, and from corresponding normal transformations of organized bodily matter into motion in conformity with the nature of a human. Footnote here, quoting Groves on the correlation of physical forces, the amount of labor which a man had undergone in the course of 24 hours might be appropriately arrived at by an examination of the chemical changes which had taken place in his body, changed forms and matter indicating the anterior exercise of dynamic force. Unquote. Back to the main text. Up to a certain point, the increased wear and tear of labor power, inseparable from a lengthened working day, may be compensated by higher wages. But beyond this point, the wear and tear increases in geometrical progression, and every condition suitable for the normal reproduction and functioning of labor power is suppressed. The price of labor power and the degree of its exploitation cease to be commensurable quantities. Section 4. Simultaneous variations in the duration, productiveness, and intensity of labor. It is obvious that a large number of combinations are here possible. Any 2 of the factors may vary and the third remain constant, or all 3 may vary at once. They may vary either in the same or in different degrees, in the same or in opposite directions, with the result that the variations counteract one another, either wholly or in part. Nevertheless, the analysis of every possible case is easy in view of the results given in 1, 2, and 3. The effect of every possible combination may be found by treating each factor in turn as variable, and the other 2 constant for the time being. We shall therefore notice, and that briefly, but 2 important cases. A. Diminishing productiveness of labor with a simultaneous lengthening of the working day. In speaking of diminishing productiveness of labor, we here refer to diminution in those industries whose products determine the value of labor power, such a diminution, for example, as results from decreasing fertility of the soil, and from the corresponding dearness or expensiveness of its products. Take the working day at 12 hours and the value created by it at 6 shillings, of which 1/2 replaces the value of the labor power, the other half forming the surplus value. Suppose, in consequence of the increased expensiveness of the products of the soil, that the value of labor power rises from 3 shillings to 4, and therefore the necessary labor time from 6 hours to 8. If there's no change in the length of the working day, the surplus labor would fall from 6 hours to 4, the surplus value from 3 shillings to 2. If the day be lengthened by 2 hours, i.e. from 12 hours to 14, the surplus labor remains at 6 hours, the surplus value at 3 shillings. But the surplus value decreases compared with the value of labor power, as measured by the necessary labor time. If the day be lengthened by 4 hours, viz. from 12 hours to 16, the proportional magnitudes of surplus value and value of labor power, of surplus labor and necessary labor, continue unchanged, but the absolute magnitude of surplus value rises from 3 shillings to 4. that of the surplus labor from 6 hours to 8, an increment of 33.33%. Therefore, with diminishing productiveness of labor and a simultaneous lengthening of the working day, the absolute magnitude of surplus value may continue unaltered, at the same time that its absolute magnitude increases, and provided the lengthening of the day be sufficient, both may increase. In the period between 1799 and 1815, the increasing price of provisions led in England to a nominal rise in wages, although the real wages, expressed in the necessaries of life, fell. From this fact, West and Ricardo drew the conclusion that the diminution in the productiveness of agricultural labor had brought about a fall in the rate of surplus value, and they made this assumption of a fact that existed only in their imaginations the starting point of important investigations into the relative magnitudes of wages, profits, and rent. But as a matter of fact, surplus value had at that time, thanks to the increased intensity of labor and to the prolongation of the working day, increased both in absolute and relative magnitude. This was the period in which the right to prolong the hours of labor to an outrageous extent was established, the period that was especially characterized by an accelerated accumulation of capital here, by pauperism there. 2 footnotes there. First, quoting Malthus's Inquiry into the Nature and Progress of Rent, 1815, corn and labor rarely march quite abreast, but there is an obvious limit beyond which they cannot be separated. With regard to the unusual exertions made by the laboring classes in periods of dearness, which produce the fall of wages noticed in the evidence, Marx adds namely before the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry, 1814-15, continuing the quote, they are most meritorious in the individuals, and certainly favor the growth of capital. But no man of humanity could wish to see them constant and unremitted. They are most admirable as a temporary relief, but if they were constantly in action, effects of a similar kind would result from them, as from the population of a country being pushed to the very extreme limits of its food." Unquote. All honor to Malthus that he lays stress on the lengthening of the hours of labor, a fact to which he elsewhere in his pamphlet draws attention, while Ricardo and others, in face of the most notorious facts, make invariability in the length of the working day the groundwork of all their investigations. But the conservative interests which Malthus served prevented him from seeing that an unlimited prolongation of the working day, combined with an extraordinary development of machinery and the exploitation of women and children, must inevitably have made a great portion of the working class, quote, supernumerary, particularly whenever the war should have ceased and the monopoly of England in the markets of the world should have come to an end. It was of course far more convenient and much more in conformity with the interests of the ruling classes, whom Malthus adored like a true priest, to explain this, quote, overpopulation by the eternal laws of nature rather than by the historical laws of capitalist production. And the second footnote, a quote from Essays on Political Economy, in which are illustrated the principal causes of the present national distress, 1830, a principal cause of the increase of capital during the war, proceeded from the greater exertions and perhaps the greater privations of the laboring classes, the most numerous in every society. More women and children were compelled by necessitous circumstances to enter upon laborious occupations, and former workmen were, from the same cause, obliged to devote a greater portion of their time to increase production." Unquote. Back to the main text. B. Increasing intensity and productiveness of labor with simultaneous shortening of the working day. Increased productiveness and greater intensity of labor both have a like effect. They both augment the mass of articles produced in a given time. Both therefore shorten that portion of the working day which the laborer needs to produce their means of subsistence or their equivalent. The minimum length of the working day is fixed by this necessary but contractile portion of it. If the whole working day were to shrink to the length of this portion, surplus labor would vanish, a consummation utterly impossible under the regime of capital. Only by suppressing the capitalist form of production could the length of the working day be reduced to the necessary labor time. But even in that case, the latter would extend its limits. On the one hand, because the notion of means of subsistence would considerably expand, and the laborer would lay claim to an altogether different standard of life. On the other hand, because a part of what is now surplus labor would then count as necessary labor. I mean the labor of forming a fund for reserve and accumulation. The more the productiveness of labor increases, the more can the working day be shortened, and the more the working day is shortened, the more can the intensity of labor increase. From a social point of view, the productiveness increases in the same ratio as the economy of labor, which, in its turn, includes not only economy of the means of production, but also the avoidance of all useless labor. the capitalist mode of production, while on the one hand enforcing economy in each individual business, on the other hand begets by its anarchical system of competition the most outrageous squandering of labor power and of the social means of production, not to mention the creation of a vast number of employments at present indispensable but in themselves superfluous. The intensity and productiveness of labor being given, the time which society is bound to devote to material production is shorter, and as a consequence, the time at its disposal for the free development, intellectual and social, of the individual is greater in proportion as the work is more and more evenly divided among all the able-bodied members of society, and as a particular class is more and more deprived of the power to shift the natural burden of labor from its own shoulders to those of another layer of society. In this direction, the shortening of the working day finds at last a limit in the generalization of labor. In capitalist society, spare time is acquired for one class by converting the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time. And that's the end of chapter 17. So, what did you think? Leave a question or comment below. I know that some of that, because he keeps repeating terms a lot, the magnitude of this, relatively, absolutely, it can get a little bit confusing, so you might have to read along with this or listen to it a couple of times, but I think that the underlying concepts which he is extrapolating from are not that difficult, so if you give it a chance, you'll probably figure this out. Anyway, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them. So, if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. It really does help, particularly as we don't run ads on this channel. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and remember that we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so take what you've learned here into your local left, into the political organizations that are forming to fight the class struggle in your area, and keep it up because it's going to take a while. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.